Hello again, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 6, Learning Operant Conditioning. So as we go along, make sure you're filling in the information that you need. How do we learn new behaviors by operant conditioning? Well, first we got to talk about what operant is. This is any observable voluntary behavior that an organism emits operate or to operate on or have an effect on the environment. And hence, operant conditioning is a form of behavioral learning in which the probability of a response is changed by its consequences, that is, by stimuli that follow the response. Common rewarding consequences, such as praise, food, or high grades, all of which can, for the most part, encourage the behaviors that they follow. To a behavioral psychologist, voluntary behavior are really controlled by things like rewards or punishments, which have no role in classical conditioning. Operant conditioning accounts for a much wider spectrum of behaviors than does the classical conditioning, and it explains new behaviors, not just reflexive behaviors. So the guy who is probably known as probably the founder of operant conditioning is a man named B.F. Skinner, who you see pictured down below here. He based his whole career on the idea that the most powerful influences on behavior are its consequences. But he wasn't really the one who coined all of this. He borrowed a lot of these ideas from some other folks, and we're going to talk about one of these men that he borrowed from. But he borrowed the concept of behavior being controlled by rewards and punishments from a man named Edward Thorndike, who you see pictured below, who demonstrated how hungry animals, particularly cats, work diligently to solve a problem by trial and error to obtain a food reward. Thorndike called this the law of effect. The law of effect is the idea that the response that produced a desirable result would be learned or stamped into the organism. Skinner, for the most part, took some of Thorndike's ideas and tweaked them, and he got rid of the subjective and unscientific speculation about the organism's feelings and intentions or goals. Skinner refused to consider what happens to an organism's mind because such speculation could not be verified by his observations. And for the most part, he took psychology on a scientific path as a result of this. So let's talk about the power of reinforcement, since that's kind of the core of operant conditioning. You have to have a reinforcer, and this is a condition involving the presentation or removal of a stimulus that occurs after the response and strengthening of that response. Skinner preferred this objective term. Food, money, and etc. Could serve this function for most people. So do attention and praise or a smile. All are examples of what we call positive reinforcement. And anything that's a positive reinforcement will strengthen a response by occurring after the response and making the behavior more likely to occur. Positive reinforcement is a stimulus presented after the response and increasing the probability of that response happening again. The thing that you need to remember is, think about it in terms of math. Positive typically means to add or to apply. So we're going to add something to get this behavior to reoccur. Okay? The opposite of that is what we call negative reinforcement, and that is the removal of something that is typically unpleasant or some kind of aversive stimuli. This is contingent on a particular behavior. So compared with punishment, using an umbrella is kind of a form of negative reinforcement because it keeps us from getting wet during a downpour. It's not a bad thing, but it's the removal of something unpleasant, and unpleasantness is getting wet. Okay, this is a behavior learned and maintained by negative reinforcement. And kind of like math, what we're doing is we're subtracting. So if you've ever seen people who train dogs, a lot of times they'll use like a dog whistle, and that whistle is to perhaps maybe stop a certain negative behavior. every time that that whistle is blown, that's kind of like you're applying. But after a while, once the behavior is learned, so like maybe keeping the dog from straying outside of their yard, you stop using the whistle. And in a sense, we're using that as a way to subtract and to take that away. All right, reinforcement technology. Something that Skinner designed was known as a Skinner box, and it's a simple device for studying the effects of reinforcers on lab animals. It's a box with a lever that the animal could press to obtain some type of food. Sometimes the Skinner box is known as an operant chamber. So as you see down here, this is an example of either what you would want to call a Skinner box or an operant chamber. This operant chamber is a box-like apparatus that can be programmed to deliver reinforcers or punishments contingent on the animal's behavior. The operant chamber, aka the Skinner box. So we have a lever here, and for the most part, there are certain lights that will signal the animal, for the most part, to do something. There is also an electrical grid, so it is possible that if the animal does what they need, they might get a reward of a food pellet. It's also possible that if the animal is not doing what they need to do, they could receive a jolt, a little shock from this chamber itself. So the importance of the operant chamber was that it could be set to control timing and frequency of the reinforcement. Okay. Skinner also designed something known as the baby tender, which you might see right here. This was a type of crib that was devised for his daughter Deborah. It consisted of an enclosed, temperature-controlled box, which unfortunately bore a superficial resemblance to an operant chamber. And so a lot of times people talk about the fact that maybe Skinner was actually researching on his own children, but I think he meant this all in good faith. All right, thank you very much.